Good morning, everyone. My name's Ron Thiessen. I'm the CEO of Northern Dynasty Minerals. Northern Dynasty is a company that owns and controls the Pebble project in Alaska. It's arguably the world's largest undeveloped polymetallic deposit in the world. We've been working on it since about 2002. We've spent roughly $1 billion on the project to date. There's no question about its geometry, geology. Does the ore exist? Is it recoverable? All of that money has been spent, and it's all well known. We've engineered it to pre-feasibility through feasibility level engineering studies, and we've taken it through permitting, although at the end of the day, we did not receive a permit. However, we did receive a very positive final EIS, and so now we're going through the process of trying to rectify the permit denial.
Ron, good to see you here. Thanks for joining us. And always nice to meet people in person. You're obviously at the conference. You're pretty much going to tell the story you're about to tell me. We've got two things to talk about today. Better introduce the asset first and tell people a little bit more in detail, and certainly some of the numbers around that. Over 20 years at it, the joys of mining, eh?
Exactly.
Joys of mining.
You know, it takes patience and fortitude and a lot of money, and then you have an overnight success.
Always. So, like, when you kick off, give us a bit more detail on some of the numbers around some of the economic studies and what you hope to be able to get from this thing. Because $1 billion, that's a lot of money, right?
Yes, but not unusual for the size and scale of the deposit. Mm-hmm. And its location is quite remote. There's no infrastructure nearby. The closest communities are 20 miles away, so there's no moving anybody. And it's in southwest Alaska, and so relatively near tidal water, so we can access ships and the like. The deposit itself is 10 billion tons in total. Mm-hmm. Contains about 53 billion pounds of copper in the measured and indicated category, 23 billion pounds of copper in the inferred, mm-hmm. 54 million ounces of gold in the measured indicated, and these are recoverable numbers, mm-hmm. not contained numbers, and 28 million ounces of gold in the inferred category. Plus, it has recoverable molybdenum, silver, uranium, and potentially palladium. So it's truly a polymetallic deposit. Its economics are roughly 55% copper, about 35% gold, and then silver and molybdenum.
Okay.
So a broad spectrum of minerals and metals is a nice diversity to have if you can get it. The engineering has demonstrated that it's very amenable to open pit mining. It will produce very clean concentrates with no deleterious penalty items. So in high demand by all the smelting and refining companies. It'll produce about 360,000 ounces of gold a year and about 330 million pounds of copper a year, plus molybdenum and silver.
Big in every way.
CapEx is total about $6.4 billion, mm-hmm. Of which we see ourselves funding, the project funding, about $4 billion, and the balance, which be the funding for the infrastructure, will come about through the Ada Corporation in Alaska, which mm-hmm. is a state-owned company that provides infrastructure. Plus, there are native corporations in Alaska that are Fortune 500 companies that are looking for revenues that are long-term returns, and something like Pebble where they can get a toll on a road, on a port, or something like that. So we think roughly $2.4 billion of the total CapEx will be funded by.
Have you had any conversations with that 2.4?
Well, we have, although they've been at a very high level and early days, and we have looked at other projects that they have done the exact same thing on. For instance, Red Dog. They mm-hmm. did all of the port facilities, the road facilities, and the energy, and that's what we're
right. Okay, so I guess it's going to be very much subject to, isn't it? And subject to part two of the conversation, which is why a project with that number of pounds, ounces, and other kinds of byproducts, what we'll call them, is not getting across the line at the moment. So what's holding you back?
So it's the same thing that many mines are being held back. There's 5 big mines in the United States, and every one of them is facing fundamentally the same anti-development crowd that we are. Now, we have an added feature to that, and that is Bristol Bay, Alaska, which is about 125, 150 miles away from the project site, or 250 miles away as streams run, is home to arguably the world's greatest sockeye salmon fishery. And so there's lots of concern about, if there's a tailings failure, will we see the same things we saw in Brazil or in British Columbia? We have spent a tremendous amount of time and money engineering our way to ensure that that doesn't happen. In fact, one of the typical thing about catastrophic tailings failure is the liquefaction of the tailings. And simply put, it's a failure to manage water properly.
Yeah.
If there's not enough water in there to liquefy the tailings, these things can't happen. So we've built into our development feature 2 large-scale water treatment plants at a cost in excess of $500 million to treat that water and discharge it into the environment as it occurs, and never hold excess water in the tailing structure, so there can never be a catastrophic tailings failure, which is exactly what the Army Corps of Engineers found in the FEIS, and their conclusion was, there isn't any kind of likelihood that there can be a catastrophic tailings failure here. So we feel that we've addressed that issue, but the anti-development crowd doesn't want to let go of it.
Right. And the anti-development crowd being local?
So it started outside of Alaska. Alaska is a favorite place for the large anti-development people to raise money because it's a small population of people, and the projects tend to be large, and there's a spot in every American's heart in the lower 48 for Alaska. So they can raise big money and only piss off a few people in Alaska on these large projects. And so that's where it starts. And then they take their typical unscientific, non-factual, emotional-based arguments and try and foment disputes up in Alaska. And so, yes, there are people in Alaska who are very concerned about catastrophic tailings failure and the impact that would have on the water and the commercial fisheries. And there's, several communities on Bristol Bay, and those communities are the ones that are most concerned about that and are not in favor of Pebble. The communities that are anywhere near within 20 or 30 miles of Pebble are the opposite. They're on side with the project. They see the opportunity. The other thing that we've done is we've created something called the Pebble Dividend Fund, and we're going to put a certain percentage of the earnings into that fund, and every adult in Western Alaska can register as a beneficiary of that fund, and they will get a check out of that. And we've modeled it on something called the Permanent Fund in Alaska. They've got a sovereign wealth fund, if you will, and most people get a payment of $1,000 to $2,000 per year out of that, and we'd see the same kind of return to people in Western Alaska, whether they are in favor of the project or not, whether they work at the project or not. Everybody would be entitled to that.
Okay, so sometimes it comes down to money for some people, but for others it's more
I understand.
Emotional drivers. Who is the arbiter of all of the work that you're doing in terms of engineering the heck out of this thing? You've got to go through and prove that you are doing things the right way. At the end of the day, you're going to want your environmental permits, your social license, and all of the other good stuff that's going to need for you to be able to break ground. How far along that process are you? How much more time is going to...
So under U.S. law, the Clean Water Act, we need a 404 permit, and that permit is managed and issued by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so it's been the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who have been providing the oversight on the permitting process, which took approximately 4 years. And they hire a third-party independent engineering company, which was AECOM, one of America's largest engineering companies, to go through this process. And it's a $50-60 million process. Our environmental baseline studies are $150 million. And they're the ones that at the end of the day sign off on what's called the final environmental impact statement. They actually prepare this. AECOM does, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers signs off on it, and Pebbles is one of the most positive ones that I've ever seen, and it concludes that there is no likelihood of a catastrophic tailings failure,
Right.
mainly because of the way we've designed and engineered water management. And then you get to all of the other stuff. I mean, our footprint is small because we focused the first 20 years of mine life, and it's a permit for 20 years of mine life, on the western end of the deposit where it daylights. So our waste to ore ratio is 0.1 to 1. So it literally everything we mine goes to the mill, and we don't have waste ups. And we're not going to put a gold plant in initially, so they're not going to introduce cyanide into the region.
Right.
We want people to get comfortable with the operations.
Right.
And as they get that comfort, so, I mean, you get to a certain social license to begin with, but there's still lots of people with discomfort. And so if they can see 10 to 20 years of operations, you're dealing with things properly, you're handling the water properly, the sustenance fishery hasn't changed, the commercial fishery hasn't changed. And in fact, if anything, we've enhanced the economics of that by bringing cheap infrastructure and cheap power to the region. Then it becomes fish and pebble, whereas the way they look at it today is fish or pebble.
Right. Right.
And that's what we want to get them to, because we believe they can have both.
Okay, interesting. So, do you give me a sense of the timing? That's the second bit of the question.
So we went through the permitting process basically the end of 2017 to mid-year 2020. We filed the FEIS in June, and it became the official record. And then we went through a process of what's called a compensatory mitigation plan, filed that, and in November, the Army Corps of Engineers issued a negative ROT. So they denied the permit and they rejected the compensatory mitigation plan. And we felt, when we looked at their reasoning, that they had ignored their findings in their FEIS.
Mm-hmm.
So we appealed that. It's called an administrative appeal, which was filed in January 2021. Mm-hmm. And we received the results of that administrative appeal in spring of this year. And I'm going to say, a bit to my surprise, because we have a situation where the Army Corps of Engineers is adjudicating itself.
Right.
But not to my surprise, because scientifically the review officer found exactly what we felt. In the denial of the permit, they said, in the event of a catastrophic tailings failure, well, your finding is that there is no event of catastrophic failure. So how can you say you're denying the permit when the facts say this is not going to happen? And you're saying, well, in the event of catastrophic tailings failure, it'll have impacts on fisheries and water and this. And you've got no basis for saying anything. She has directed them to remove that language from their evaluation and base their evaluation on the findings in the FEIS.
Right.
And there's a whole series of those kinds of things that she has highlighted and given them directions on how they must reassess this. And she has said, or she and her commander have said, it's called a remand order. They've ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to redo the evaluation of the permit and the compensatory mitigation plan. And when I look at this, it looks to me like the decision will be the other way around.
Okay. So during this 4-year process for the FEIS, it was the same team, same group? Because sometimes when, over time, groups change, people move on.
Same group that did the FEIS was the same people, yes.
Right, okay. So they said,
Yep.
unlikely. And then was another group who then said, well, in the event...
So, again, it's a question of where that decision was made.
Right.
And it appears that the ultimate decision was made in Washington, D.C., and the regional office in Alaska had much less to do with the decision on issuance of the permit. And so we see that as a political interference. I mean, remember, we're at that particular point in time, we're talking 2020, we're talking the height of the presidential election.
Okay.
And that's one of the things, having been in the business for a while, if you can avoid a critical political event, do so. Because to enter that period of time, there are so many things that are happening, so many quid pro quos, so many balls in the air.
So coming back to the time question, I get was it reorder? Is it you reorder?
Remand.
Remand. Only the military. Remand, that process takes how long?
So there's one other complication in that, and that is the EPA, which has been the main source of holding up many projects in the United States, have promulgated a final decision, although it's not final, on vetoing any mine development in this area of Alaska. And they're talking about 310 square miles around the Pebble project.
Okay.
And so that stands there. That's a decision that they've made under the Clean Water Act. And so it's unlikely the Army Corps of Engineers can issue a positive decision as long as that's standing there. And so we have to figure out, how do we remove the EPA's final determination that they promulgated?
Yeah.
We have prepared a judicial challenge to that, and we were ready to file that in court, and we are very confident that we can overturn it. But because that final determination covers state land, it's as important to the state as it is to us. And so the state said, we have different reasons for arguing this than you do. Not only is what the EPA done ultra vires in terms of statutory authority, it's way beyond their statutory authority, but it's also a breach of a contract between us and the federal government. And we believe it's unconstitutional. So the state has a right to take issues like this directly to the Supreme Court, bypass the district federal court, bypass the Court of Appeal, and that means bypass 4 years of court proceedings. And so the state has filed this claim with the Supreme Court of the United States, and we will hear in October if the Supreme Court's going to hear it, which we believe they will, and if they do, we think that this can be resolved inside the next year, and at that point, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can complete their remand order, and they could issue a new decision on a permit.
Okay. So, I guess, because if I'm looking in as a prospective investor, it's a super big project, super big revenues, and obviously for the state taxes as well. But as an investor, I'm thinking
they're huge.
Are there better ways to deploy my capital, or do I say I'll take a bit of my money and I'll take a punt on this and say, but I'm going to park it in the back of the drawer for a while, clearly, because it's been a long time to this point. It's going to be a long, even if you do get everything you need, it's going to be a long point to where we get to actually FIDs and all of that sort of stuff and raising the money, and that's a process in itself. It'll be a long time in the making. So how do I make?
So
money?
there are some near-term events that I think are triggers that while they're not the ultimate answer, they mitigate risk, and they set us up for success at the end of the day. One is the October decision by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says we're going to hear this. I think that's a huge lift, and it's the Supreme Court has made 3 rulings in the last 6-8 months, all against the EPA on statutory overreach. In fact, they just issued a huge ruling on what's called the Sackett case, which they fundamentally rewrote the rules on waters of the U.S. And waters of the U.S. are extremely important at Pebble because, with the way the EPA measures waters of the U.S., they said, you're 100% jurisdictional wetlands. Well, with the new ruling and our hydrological engineers looking at it, that assessment that we're 100% waters of the U.S. could be reduced anywhere from 50 to 90%. And that would have big implications for the impacts that we have and how we compensate for those impacts. So again, you're going to see, the EPA has issued their new regulations to account for Sackett, but you're going to see over the next 6 months other states and people starting to challenge that. And then I think that we're going to see some activity out of other mining companies. Everybody wants this project, but and we had a lot of people. We chose who we were going to go do a deal with in the first instance back in 2007. And we only picked 3 companies, and all 3 agreed. And the first one that wrote the check got it. We still think that there's no project like Pebble out there in the world. They would all want it. People will want to figure out, how do I get my toe in the water? And so I think we'll see some of that activity through the next 6 to 12 months.
There's not too many people with a balance sheet to be able to come attack this. It's rarefied air.
It is, but there's at least a half dozen companies out there,
right.
and they're all looking for it.
Right.
I mean, I'm going to be presenting my presentation tomorrow, and I was kidding with the guys that are sitting over at the table over there. You know, when I talk about, why you should want copper,
Mm-hmm.
one of the biggest gold miners in the world, he's desperate for copper. He's been very public about it. So why do I have to say anything other than, well, if Mark Bristow wants copper, everybody else should want copper.
He told me a month ago he did.
Yeah.
I know he does. But at the same time, he also needs to know that he can get this thing over the line soon, as he's got near-term drivers, right?
Yes.
Okay. So far we've had a conversation where we've kind of skipped merrily through the what you have and technically how you get at it. No one's doubting that. Are there any kind of long poles in the tent, any red flags on that side of things that we need to be aware of?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, we're developing a project that these kinds of mines have been developed and been operating for hundreds of years. I'm the chairman of Gibraltar, or Seco Mines,
Mm-hmm.
and the Gibraltar mine, which is a porphyry, albeit mainly a single metal porphyry, it's been operating since 1971.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very standard. We know how they operate. It's not a high risk in development, not a high risk in operations. There's no metallurgical issues. We've taken a low profile approach to how we're developing it.
Mm-hmm.
There's huge opportunities for much higher grades down the road when we go into permitting for extensions or alterations to the mine plan.
But it's slowly, right? This is big. This is multi-decade, multi-generational opportunity. But you're telling me this is purely a legal process that you've got to get through. It's technically, as far as your proof of concept of what's under the ground. Everything's done. No, don't need to spend much money on it.
Almost $1 billion has been spent there. There's no question that this exists.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some question about how much more is there, because there's much more than
You've got
billion.
enough for now.
Yes.
Okay. So that's all.
Our
good.
problem is not shortage of tons.
Yeah. So which is kind of exciting bit to this. But once you get through the legal bit, then you've got the funding bit. So you were saying there's half a dozen people potentially who would not be frightened by the kind of the CapEx component or the length of time it takes to kind of get into kind of future revenues.
And I mean, at current metal prices, and with the CapEx we're facing, it's got a 4-year payback. It's got a $2.3 billion NPV at a 7% discount. It's got a 16% IRR. Those are all very acceptable for this size and scale of a project that has a 20-year mine life. But that's only harvesting 10% of the ore body.
Yeah, I know.
And the rest of the ore body is much higher grade. We focused on this end of the deposit for environmental reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Most people in our business would say we need to focus on the economics more than anything else. We said, no, we've got to put the social, the comfort level, the environmental at the forefront and get everybody comfortable.
Do your numbers include the build of infrastructure from roads and power and so forth?
$6.4 billion.
You would, okay. It's in that $6.4 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay.
There's no roads in Western Alaska. There's no infrastructure. It costs $13 for a half gallon of milk. It costs $8 for a gallon of gas. When we build the infrastructure, those numbers will more than drop in half. The cost of living for people it's going to be a game changer.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a few more hoops for you to jump through in terms of social license, a few more hoops to jump through the courts and so forth. And hopefully you're right about the time frame. What else can you be doing whilst you're waiting? Because your shareholders are waiting. Everyone's waiting.
So, I mean, there's more final detailed engineering to be done.
Right.
But that's spending money, and I don't want to dilute on an equity basis.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the opportunity exists for somebody to come in the near term and be spending money on taking those elements forward.
Right. Have you got cash today?
We do.
Enough.
And we've done a royalty transaction with a group that provides us ultimately with a total of $60 million. We've received the first $12.5 million. We think the next 12.5 is coming soon, and then the balance will come through July of next year.
Right.
That's enough to carry us with everything that we have to do for a good 4 to 5 years.
Everything you're obliged to do.
Yes.
Right, because obviously you've got optionality as to how you spend that capital. So can I ask then, because I always say to people, mining's tough, and sometimes mines have got to go through several iterations before they actually get to the person who's going to get it out of the ground now. So in a meaningful way, the name of the game is to stay in the game, to be able to play the game.
And it's not unusual that
Right.
you have 4 or 5 players on a single deposit. So
Right.
A lot of people say to me, oh, but all these people have walked away. Tech walked away, Rio walked away, Anglo walked away, First Quantum. I said, and every single one of them added tremendous value while they were there. They left because of things that was happening to them, not because of what was happening at Pebble.
Okay, so other portfolio drivers. Okay. And so there may be a few people coming to the table, and maybe I think we've seen there's a Great Western Copper and Gold. I think they've got a couple of majors sharing the load there. And I understand what you're talking about. Okay.
Western Copper up in the Yukon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Rio and absolutely. It's the nature of the game.
Yeah, it is. And I think we'll see the same thing with nickel as well.
Yep.
These kind of big billion-dollar projects, multi-year life of mine.
You spread the risk.
Indeed. Well, a nice introduction to the story. Appreciate it, because when I was sort of looking at the numbers, it's kind of what I'm trying to work out what's going on. I understand the opportunity, but I've also, I think, better understand the time frames now. So I appreciate.
Well, it's not going to be overnight now.
Yeah,
but I'll be back next year or the year after, and then we'll say, well, it was overnight success.
Can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you.